you want something pretty close to like physiological levels to where you can manage estradiol and DHT very reasonably. And so I think something at 200 mg per week of testosterone would be very suitable and very low risk. Back to your original question, though, Steve, like starting points, I would still be a testosterone first kind of guy and not be a SARM goblin or anything of this such. I think starting dosage wise, along lines that we all have spoken to, I think a great paper to look at is like that Bazin paper of 2001, I think it was, where you have varying graded dosages of testosterone. Again, to get some ideas of what really moves the needle into supraphysiological territory. And that one group that was on 125 milligrams per week, that was about a replacement dosage for those guys. They're around like the 600 to 700 nanogram per deciliter. But when they jump to 300 mgs of test per week, they go supraphysiological, which was around this. It was over 1200 nanogram per deciliter. I don't remember it exactly, but that's the point of superphys, right? So if you're looking at this range, like 125 to 300 for some individuals, that's going to move the needle a lot. So what I would want in my first cycle would be moving beyond my natural levels for one, or pretty close to it, because you don't want to be under, because that's just not beneficial at all. So I think starting even at 200 milligram testosterone per week would be reasonable, and then to assess where that moves you if you have some natural lab work in place. And why I say low is milk the most from the least. And it also gives you the opportunity to learn how to manage if there was a side effect to come about, but it'd be a less likely issue to have a side effect come about versus starting at 300-400 milligram of testosterone. For you, as genetically weak individual, that takes you way beyond, and now you have to deal with, oh man, now I have like estrogen issues, my gyno's filling up, or something along these lines, and you're having to backpedal and figure it out. And as a first-time user, I don't think you want that complication. You want something pretty close to like physiological levels to where you can manage estradiol and DHT very reasonably. And so I think something at 200 mg per week of testosterone would be very suitable to do so, and very low risk. In that same study, like some of the guys that were running 600 milligram testosterone per week, over 20 weeks, you see a little HDL lowering, a little hematocrit rising, but for the most part, it's fairly benign for that duration of time. So I think this gives you a lot of ground as a start point just to keep driving that up and make a lot of progress. And I don't think you actually need a set timeline per se. I think your timeline is probably more depictive of what's going to be your limitation factor when you're bulking. I think some guys that run into like getting too fat too quick, or digestive issues, getting, appetite smashed, or they're just smashed from training and they need to then scale back and deload or do some type of fat loss phase. And that would detect like moving the dosage back down to a maintenance. But if you're at tier like this 200 milligram, you wouldn't need to do that. Mm-hmm. But I think that's kind of the start of a framework of where I would go from there. Would you guys agree on that dosing, or would you change something about it?
I think that's reasonable. I mean, you're basically doubling your serum levels for most people,
Can I touch on 2 points that I think get misunderstood? So when we're looking at blood work from a medical point of view, hemoglobin and hematocrit are not the biggest deal, right? A lot of doctors, and they learn this stuff. I don't know if they just forgot it or they're just doing it to protect their own ass. Those aren't the concerning things when they go up a little bit. What we look at is platelet count. So if you need to see a phlebotomist to give blood, it's when your platelet count is elevated, because that's what's going to cause the clotting issues, not a rise in hemoglobin or hematocrit, right? You don't obviously want them super high, but they in and of themselves are not the risk that we're looking at. So we don't obsess about, that's kind of a benefit of using steroids, right? Prevents anemia. If you give blood every time your hematocrit or hemoglobin goes slightly above the range, you can become anemic. It doesn't make any sense.
So much iron.
I just look at platelet count. Platelet count's in the middle of the range, you're generally fine. Right. The other thing is to define physiological versus supraphysiological, and I think this gets lost on the internet. So what we're taught in school, and people can ask you for references, and unfortunately, unless you want to buy an endocrinology textbook, I don't have there's not necessarily studies that show all this stuff. Some information you just have to understand, you just take from people that are more educated than you, and you just accept it. What we're defining supraphysiological is generally at 300 milligrams. And the reason being is that in the average person, that'll get your serum level over 1,400 nanograms per deciliter every day, as an average is a low. In order to cause muscle growth through the 3 anabolic pathways from drugs, from testosterone alone, this does not include other anabolics, you need to be above 1400. That if it drops below that, you're not anabolic. So what we see for the average person, there are people that might get above 1400 on 200 milligrams. So I think with physiological, right? So I think people get too obsessed about the numbers. Like, well, we produce 11 milligrams of testosterone a day, and if you add that out, 100 milligrams is TRT. That might be fine for TRT. For some people, it might also be inadequate. I wasn't ever taught to use 100 milligrams for TRT. But we generally look at under 250 is considered physiological, even if the dose is more than you would naturally produce, because on the average person, it's not going to get you on an average above 1400 nanograms. So that's kind of what we're looking at. And that's how you define those terms. It's not that just because it's more than you would produce, that it's all of a sudden this magical amount of steroids. Very few guys are going to grow a significant amount of mass on 200 milligrams a test. Most of that mass is probably because they were under eating incorrectly, not training correctly, not sleeping well, right? There were other things going on. So
wait.
Call that,
Are you saying guys on 200 milligrams a week are using TRT as a crutch to compensate?
Yeah, of course, for bad lifestyle stuff. Totally. I honestly, I call placebo balling when guys are growing. They're like, I took 100 milligrams of this and I blew up. Well, yeah, that's because all of a sudden you decided that you weren't going to drink, you're going to get better sleep, you're going to start eating better. It was those factors more than, yes, you fixed your hormone profile, so there's some effect there. But again, you're not leveraging anabolics to the extent that the anabolic is driving the growth per se.
Yeah, I agree. I think on a primed natural athlete that's been grinding for 5 years in the gym, 100 milligrams to 200 is not going to move the needle much. Maybe 200. But obviously, right, if their testosterone levels are high and they're basically pushing against their natural potential, they might need a little bit more, unless they're pushing against their natural potential with a natural testosterone level of 400. Then I don't mind bringing that up to 800 to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter, right, to kind of assess response. But since it will take for most esters about 4 weeks for serum levels to peak, at 4 weeks you can do your blood work and kind of assess, and then obviously you would probably have 3 months of progress in you, and then make a dose adjustment. So you would start maybe between 200 to 300 milligrams, and then based on your progress, you would slowly ramp that up, and then maybe a liver-rich aromatase inhibitor or some sort of DHT derivative to kind of keep estrogen in range or getting your body fat levels down. God forbid.
And can I just touch on the TRT dosing too, the way that I was taught? And so general practitioners, wellness doctors, urologists are probably not taught the same stuff. What we're taught within standard of care is, let's say Dean comes to me and he's hypogonadal. Most guys are afraid of needles, right? Let's say you're 40 years old, you've never injected anything. It's weird. Your wife is strange, is not super into you injecting needles. You give the guy 100 milligrams. Most likely he's not going to feel a whole lot, and he's not going to want to continue, right? He's going to be like, this is for the birds. Like, this hurts, is a lump now. I don't really feel a whole lot different than I did before. The primary reason is, one, you give them, depending on the way the test is made, either give them the 200 or the 250. They feel amazing right away. You can always back down if you need to, if the blood markers change or there's something wrong or there's side effects. But that way, at least you have patient compliance, right? When you give them the proper dose immediately, you can always shift it. If you give them a low dose, you're generally not going to work it up. Most doctors don't increase doses. The other reason that people seem to miss is that from a measurement point of view, we are all educated. We know how to measure things. I could tell, John knows the difference. He knows how to calculate, to measure GH and peptides and all these things. The average person can't do math, right? They did a study with McDonald's and they asked people about the quarter pounder, and people didn't understand what size a quarter pounder was. So you're going to tell a guy to dilute something with a weird amount and measure to that, like, they're going to get it wrong. So generally drugs are given in the dose that they come, right? Testosterone comes in 200 or 250 milligrams per ml. You give them a 1 ml syringe. You say, fill the syringe, inject it once a week. It doesn't mean
Serostim, right?
It doesn't mean it's best practice. It's just simple. You don't give someone amoxicillin and say, it's a 500 milligram pill, but what I want you to do is cut it in thirds. And I want you to take it every 2.5 days at 9 hours, 9 hours into the day. No one's going to do that right. You give, Serostim is a perfect example. If you're over 140 pounds, you take the bottle. They don't have people diluting it with 1.8 mLs of water and pulling 3 units and doing it at this time. It leads to disaster. No one does it right.
Well, that's what the bodybuilders do. We try to reinvent the wheel, which is fun.
When unfortunately you're not going to outsmart Merck or Pfizer.
Yeah,
it's not going to happen.
Yeah, Dean, what do you think about first cycle practices?
Yeah, I'm relatively in agreement. Although I think having that hormone baseline as a natural gives you a stepping point to build from. So obviously we're taking the assumption here that we've got a natural athlete whose total testosterone level, say, is 25 nanomole per liter, or whatever, 800 to 900 nanogram per deciliter. Yeah, if you give them 125 test, it's going to probably yield the same serum level. You give them 250, you've now pretty much doubled their serum level. The only time I'd be a bit cautionary is, let's say you do have someone who is a natural athlete who is, for all intents and purposes, hypogonadal on paper, but doesn't exhibit hypogonadal symptoms. So their total test level is 8 to 10 nanomole. You give them 250 milligrams of test, their level is now 45. You've quadrupled their total test level. Yeah, that's probably going to see a brilliant effect to that level, but you've now quadrupled total testosterone that could bring side effects, unwanted metabolic outcomes like estrogen, DHT. So I guess you have to look at where your natural level is to start and then adjust from there. I mean, we had this discussion. I brought this point up at the conference last week of if we're going to start picking medical dosages to give athletes like the enhanced games, all right, let's just start giving 600 milligrams based on Bayesian study. Mm-hmm. We have to tailor to that person's biochemistry what their total level is, and then adjust the dose from there. That's my personal take on it. And you're going to end up somewhere between 200 to 300 milligrams anyway to take someone's level double or triple their natural level if they are, in that mid-20s. But for someone who's a little lower, going too high too quick to start, like John said, you want to milk the absolute most from the least dose.
Yeah. And I think it's a good point what John made, is that we're starting this first cycle during the off season, because then the food is in place, right? The training is at the highest capacity, so you're basically pushing against this natural limit that you're in. And then a low dose of a couple hundred milligrams testosterone goes a very long way, because again, the food is in surplus, and you've already learned how to be anabolic through several dieting phases. What I will add to that is that I think it's a good idea to do your last natty diet before you start your first cycle, so you start lean, so you don't have to worry too much about the aromatization. And you can see the changes on your physique, because you don't have to X-ray through this layer of fat where, at least your abs and your glutes and your quad separation and all that stuff, the visual changes are so apparent, not only to yourself, but to everybody in the gym. And then now with social media, you can milk the fuck out of it, make some money while you're at it. Of course, if you're 25, don't promote the drugs, because your audience is even younger. That's the biggest problem nowadays on TikTok. So basically, you start from this ideal point where you can see your physique. You just come from a cutting phase. Your calories might be a little bit low, but you can ramp that up. And I think through multiple caloric adjustments, even if you start with 200 milligrams or 300 milligrams of testosterone and nothing else, you can make so much progress. And we're talking about 10, 20, 30 pounds on your first cycle, starting from this, reasonably lean state.
Well, we've seen some pretty good effects with starting with guys. I think there's a lot of value to doing your first show natural. Some might not want to do that, but I think you'll learn actually nutrition training, fatigue management aspects, peaking without the drug masking and the complication of masking as well. Right. Coming off the back end of that, you're going to be suppressed in several different positive hormones. I think from a natural, that could be a very good starting point as well, versus what's the difference of we're going to let these natural levels come back up through just normal processes and timing. Then we could start our first one. Might as well start it right out the gate there, low, at a time when, man, you'll leverage so much out of that gate. So if you're not competing, that's okay. Like Steve suggested, do a cut phase, come off that, so you have a lot of runway to grow. But if you're competing, I'd say at least do your first show natural. And then if you decide, hey, move it from there, do a couple of shows natural and move up the needle.